Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Collision Live. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined at the desk, as I always am, by the deodorant to my body odor, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
No, not too much, Daniel. Good to be back in the saddle after a week off.
Yeah, so we missed last week. I was, the old heart isn't pumping.
The old ticker's
as
not
well
ticking
as-
like it ought to.
Or maybe it's ticking a little too much. So I was in the ER working on some stuff, but the whole time I was there getting my heart checked, I was thinking, if only I could be back at the desk for another episode.
This is what kept you going. I'm glad to know
I was
that
like-
this is the reason that you pulled through for us.
Yeah, the heart's got to keep going because there's always more cultural conversations to talk about, and there's some interesting conversations for us to get into today. Kind of some controversies and just some general stuff. A little Star Wars sprinkled in, maybe some Taylor Swift if we get that far. We'll see how that goes. So excited to have you guys join us again. If you're joining us live, or even if you're watching this or listening to this after the fact, share your comments. Jump into the comment section. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts. Let Sam know why he's wrong. We always appreciate some of that. Before we do it, I also just wanted to share that. That I sort of I was two-timing us. Although this podcast is my home, I was dabbling in some other podcasts recently.
I heard about that.
So I actually had the opportunity to join on the Overthinkers podcast for their latest episode. It's a great podcast with two great hosts. And Nathan, one of the hosts, has written and contributed to the Collision before. So he pulled me over there to talk about, is pop culture valuable? And if it is, how is it valuable? So we sort of geek out for about an hour, as Christians, is thinking, what value is there for pop culture? Get into some interesting stuff. So I encourage you guys, check that out. They got a lot of good stuff going on over there, but we also have a lot of good stuff going on right here. So why don't we jump right into things with cultural conversations? So let's kick things off with a little bit of controversy. Why not jump right into the deep end? And there's kind of two aspects, I guess, of this conversation. There's the more sort of like inside industry, cinephile movie stuff, which I know isn't maybe, everyone watching us or listening to us isn't necessarily of utmost interest to them. But I do think jumping off of that, there is some very relevant, important, or at least interesting conversations just about how we evaluate movies. But kind of why this has become more of a cultural conversation is Rotten Tomatoes, the site that everyone loves and loves to hate, and sometimes flip-flops depending on what movie you're talking about. Sort of the aggregator of a lot of critical reviews, has found itself in a little bit of controversy. For some movie a couple of years ago, sort of a lesser known film that it was revealed that some of the PR firms and people out there, reviewers, were gaming the system of this website.
No.
Yeah, believe it or not, even offering money for critics to give it positive reviews and trying to change the score of this thing because Rotten Tomato, like the Rotten Tomato meter score, has become like such a essential thing to like understanding films. Like whenever a new movie comes out,
It's such if you get that fresh score, it's such a stamp of approval, and I think they've kind of become the inadvertent gatekeepers of, what films do well and which ones don't.
Yeah, and then if you don't get that good score, then it's this is why critics are useless. We don't need critics. This movie's for the fans. Those terrible critics. But regardless of sort of how that website has been approached, it has become a very influential way to it is, like you said, kind of the big stamp of approval of hey, it's good because Rotten Tomatoes gave it an 82%. Or a lot of people check that score before they decide what movies to see. And so it has become, quite influential. And sort of this whole controversy, and there's been discussions from it, and too technical for us to get into on this, but kind of from that discussion, there's just been kind of a resurgence of this conversation as far as what does it mean to evaluate a film? What is it? Is a site like Rotten Tomatoes the best way to do that? Is film criticism, whether that's like a critic or just a audience member going to a movie and sort of not criticizing in the negative sense, but evaluating hey, is this good? Is it bad? Why is it good? Why is it bad? How do we do that? And has some of our things like Rotten Tomatoes shaped that perhaps for the worse? We'll get into a little bit with like the scores, but what is your some of your initial thoughts for some of this story?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anytime there's you know, like evaluations or like on a scale of 1 to 10 or a thumbs up, thumbs down, like I think there's an opportunity to game that system, and I think that's just any system that gets established. There's opportunity for it to be gamed, and so again, you just look at people's incentives, and you can generally figure out why the system is maybe broken or not good. But I think beyond that, I think it's also kind of become shorthand for evaluating whether or not you should see a film or if a film is worth your time. And so I think it's just weird that like a film can be like good or bad, or like that films have like a rating. I think is kind of interesting, and I think it speaks to the fact that most people just want like black and white on if they're going to spend their money and their time on something. Like, is it good or is it bad? And unfortunately, I think that sort of short circuits a lot of what a movie can be and should be. And so I think it just sets people up to like maybe some false expectations when they're thinking about movies or going to view a movie. Like, really what they want to know, like, is this going to be like fun and am I going to enjoy it or not? Not, is this going to be challenging? Is there nuance? Like, is it an interesting thought experiment? And so I think this has contributed maybe to the broader lack of nuance that we see in our culture.
Yeah, 'cause even like sort of our like modern conception of like criticism, whether it's music or movies or books or whatever. I feel like most people would think of 5 stars, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah.
86% on the tomato meter. Like, it is sort of this. It's like a numerical or else like a picture. Like, but it's some sort of score. And like that's sort of what evaluating a film is. Like, it's good or bad, and like here's the metric. Which, like, if you read old school like evaluations and criticisms, like they didn't do that. Like, some of them did, but like for the most part, like it was more like, hey, here's as someone that sort of is an expert in this field, in this craft, like here's some insights to help you have like to dialogue with this thing, get the most out of this thing, and how to approach it more thoughtfully, rather than like, don't go because it's bad or go because it's good. Like, it's more like facilitating engagement with the thing, rather than just like a very sort of, like you said, shorthand, lazy way of just like, hey, don't go, it's not worth it. It's only a 62%, like, or do go. And even some of the problem with all of these sort of numbers, like we have a graphic we can throw up if you're watching the video version of us, of just like the Rotten Tomato score, because it is misunderstood. Like, it's I think a lot of people check the score, but not a whole lot of people get like how it works. Where if a film is rated like 82%, it doesn't mean that critics think that it's like an 8.2 out of 10. Like, the score itself is just sort of aggregated by like how many critics gave it basically a 60% or more. Like I said, yeah, it's fine. So like if you can see, if you're watching the video version, like if all the critics say hey, this is like a 6 point out of 10, like it's fine, it's not bad, then the movie will get 100% because 100 of them said it was fine. Where if in the other examples, like if most critics gave it like a 90 something, and hey, this movie is fantastic, but 1 or 2 thought it was too challenging, didn't really get what they were going for, like all of a sudden that movie's going to drop down to like a 70. Even though like overall people were way more enthusiastic, like they're praising the stuff rather than like, hey, there's not too much to hate about this thing. So it is, but like if you're looking on the outside, it's like, oh, this movie got 100, this movie got 70, therefore the one with 100 must be better. It's a misleading picture. Like, and again, Rotten Tomatoes isn't the only sort of site that does these sort of things, but it is. I think it has established this mindset of sort of how we evaluate films, and I think as Christians too, sort of bring this sort of into like the faith realm. I do think we are products of that too. We're like, we because criticism has become sort of the tomato model of like just a number. That we sort of have become conditioned to like approach films that way, rather even if we use different metrics, like rather than like how do I engage with this film, like how do I dialogue with this film beyond just good, bad, wholesome, vulgar, has no bad content and swears, has a couple swears. Uh,
Yeah.
how can we go deeper? Like, what do you think with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, even just thinking about how much of our lives has been reduced to like a rating system. Like if you think about an Uber driver, like they have a rating. If you think about an Airbnb host, they have a rating. Restaurants have a rating. Places of business have a rating. And I think, I mean, there are certainly benefits to that. And I think for movies, I think it's good to know, like, what are people saying about this movie. But I think the problem is most people don't go beyond like that rating. And I think this kind of dovetails into sort of why why do we bother reviewing movies here on the Collision? And I think it's because it's going beyond just that, like, yes, go see it, no, don't go see it, or like whatever the moral content of the film is, but really just about like how to approach a movie. And I think the problem is most people aren't going to take the time to say, okay, well, how should I think about this film before I go see it? They just want to see, is it worthwhile? And they're not really going to think critically about it, likely. And so I think, ratings can be good, but it also can sort of short circuit, I think, the deeper understanding and the more meaningful connection to a work of art, especially, but even just, more broadly.
Yeah, because I think even like I know when we started doing reviews for the Collision, like I think we did do, I forget if it was like, I think it was like a 5-star scale. Like we were doing kind of this because, hey, movie review, that's what you do movie reviews.
Yeah.
And then like the more that like we reviewed films and like that I was sort of writing these reviews of films, just realizing like how unhelpful that is. Like,
Yeah.
like what is, it's a 3.5. Like what does that mean? Like that's just, it's a number.
Right.
Like,
Well, and it's the same with the tomato thing. Like, what's a 100%? Like, because it's still like, so who's saying that, and based on what? Like, what is being measured? I guess is the
especially
problem.
if you like, I think to give like a to set the mood of like, oh, it seems like a lot of people are liking this movie, and then if that leads you to go check out some critics and stuff and like actually read the dialogues, I think it can be helpful in that way. But that's like we did away with the 5-star rating, and like even like our reviews for the last couple of years at the Collision, like we break it into 3 categories. Which if you guys we hope you're checking out our movie reviews. But we do like, basically I'll do like an evaluation of the movie. Like, hey, here's the basic overview, sort of my thoughts. Like I still give opinions if I think things are good. Like, hey, the cinematography was bad, the acting was bad, or it was good. Sort of evaluate the movie, and then like we do content, like sort of the moral evaluation of like, hey, there's a bunch of sex in this movie. Like, be aware of that. Probably maybe don't go see it. There's a lot of profanity. Like, don't be caught off guard. Like, this is a very violent movie. Like, so we do that. And then like the last part is like the theme, like the dialogue of like, okay, even beyond that, like maybe it's a movie that the craftsmanship it's fine, like the moral stuff, like there's a little bit, maybe not too much, but like on a deeper level, like what is this movie saying? Like what's the conversations? Like is it dealing with interesting stuff that as Christians like we can kind of engage with? And like one of the things I do like as a reviewer is like I give my opinion. Like I feel like that's part of the job, but
Yeah.
but rather I try and sort of at least give a framework for people to make their own decision. For like, hey, this is what's being said. I'm not necessarily going to tell you, weigh into if I think that's good or bad, but I just, hey, these are some of the questions the film asks. Like, be on the lookout for that. And here's some stuff I noticed. Like,
Which I think, like for you, bringing a framework into how you think about a movie, I think that's way more helpful. I think for potential viewers of that movie than just like Daniel gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Like that just does nothing for me. Like I have no idea what that means, as a viewer or as someone who's potentially interested in a movie. It's like, well, this guy thinks it's great, but it's like, I'm not that guy. And like, why does he think it's so great? And what does that mean? And so I think helping like put it into a framework and saying, this is why I think, these things are this way, or this is, my opinion on it. And I think it is important to have opinion on movies. And I think it's important for critics to be like, you should sort of say, you know, your thoughts on a movie. I think that's very helpful, and explain why you think the way you do, because I think that just kind of opens up that dialogue and helps people understand, okay, this is, you know, if you know you, then it's like, okay, well, I know where he's coming from on it, and so that makes sense. And maybe I'll disagree, and I actually really like, movies with very little dialogue and lots of empty space, but you don't, and so that's, I can take that into consideration. And I think it just goes back to why it's important to have some nuanced conversations about movies, and it's more important for the critic to sort of explain some of this stuff rather than just like go by like some scale. Like,
yeah, and even so, there is different metrics. Like I think a lot of Christians, as someone that writes these reviews and gets feedback, like I think some of the
all positive, I'm sure,
that we can stop. Like it's just sort of basically, I think some people, at least, like they skip to the content. Like, it's like, is there good stuff? Is there bad stuff? Like they're not interested if like, is the craft of the film well executed? Like, it's
yeah,
just, hey, they don't swear, there's no sex, there's no violence. Like, sign me up for this movie. Or else if there is any of that kind of stuff, like they skip the dialogue of it, of like, well, because there's profanity in this movie, like it's a bad movie.
mm-hmm.
Where it's like, well, like, is it though? Like, it might be a movie that you choose not to watch because there's profanity, and you have, you're calling to holiness, and that's inconsistent with what you think, and all of that is valid. But like, is that a bad movie because it, or if it, if the worldview expressed is like naturalistic and it isn't biblical, does that make it a bad movie, or does it, or can I look through all those lenses of like, well, like, I don't agree with it, but like, it's crafted well. I can have a dialogue with it. Like,
You understand what they're saying.
Yeah, like, I can land on a different conclusion, and like, but is that a bad movie? Like, I think that level of engagement with films is just sort of lacking. I think there's a bunch of reasons. Again, we don't have reason or time to get into all those reasons. Like, I think even just the way that a lot of faith-based films have conditioned us to not really worry about the quality and just to assume that there's not bad. Like, it's kind of conditioned us, like, this is a good movie because it doesn't have this.
And I just think like, this is a broad generalization of faith-based films, but it's insulting, I think, to your audience to just say like, never mind the craftsmanship, but you'll agree with the message. Like, I just find that insulting. It's like, don't give me a message that I'll agree with in a bad wrapping. It's like, take the time to do it well.
Yeah, because I've also,
or otherwise, like, what's it
like, I've often said, like, if you take a faith-based film and you just like swap the religion being expressed to like a different religion or a different worldview, is the audience that gave it a glowing review still going to do that? Like, is it
right?
Because I suspect a lot of them won't, which indicates at least like you're not really affirming the movie. Like, you're affirming the message. Like, you're not approaching or dialoguing in like an honest way with it. It affirms you, so it's good. And as soon as you change some of that, like, it obviously wasn't about the craftsmanship and some of that. But hey, I do think it is important for Christians to be thoughtful, to dialogue with films. I think we miss out on a lot of interesting conversations happening in culture because we sort of fall back on these metrics, whether it's just like a Rotten Tomato thing or whether it's more like the baptized metrics of like, content bad, bad content makes the movie bad, no bad content makes it a good movie. And I think we miss out on sort of joining into some of these conversations. But I know one thing that if it were a movie, if it were ranked from critics, would probably get 100% on the Rotten Tomato tomato meter. And is our next segment, which is Host Corner. So 2 Host Corners ago, Sam did a cooking video tutorial, so I did a cooking tutorial. Last Host Corner, Sam did a book review. So I'm going to do a book review because my life is just trying to mimic Sam in all possible ways. But I thought I would share one because I forgot it was my Host Corner until I was just leaving for the studio. So I was scrambling a bit. But to share a book, a recent book that I read, it's called The Will of the Many by James Islington. Who this is the first book in a new series. He's had one other series before, so he's pretty new. author. But I'm a sucker for fantasy, especially sort of high concept fantasy. That's my jam. With some like sophisticated magic and just sort of some coming of age, all those things that I think makes the genre good. And this one, as someone that has read an obscene amount of fantasy novels, probably too much for someone my age. I got bookshelves of this. This book is probably my favorite fantasy book that I've read in 5-6 years. It's super engaging. The author, I don't know what his like belief system is, like if he's a Christian or he's not a Christian, but his books are very clean. There's no sex, there's no profanity, there's not even really violence. There's some intentionally like appropriate violence, but it's not like this isn't Game of Thrones or something that you have to like wade through cautiously with some of that stuff. It is a clean story. It's an engaging story. It does deal with some interesting concepts for Christians. And it's just it's hard to not like. It's a nice, thick fantasy book. Same. I know there's some different holidays coming up in the next month or two. If you guys are looking for a good novel, a good fictional read, and you're into the fantasy stuff, check it out. The Will of the Many. I think the second book's coming out next year, so you have time to kind of get on board with that. But Sam, how many? How on a scale of 1 to 10, perhaps? How intrigued are you now to check out this book?
I would say maybe like a 7 or 8. Yeah, I mean
that's a fresh. That's a Rotten Tomato.
Yeah,
fresh.
I'll go see if I can find it on audio, and maybe I'll read it that way.
Which I do. My wife is currently listening to the audiobook of it because I pulled that card and said, you got to listen to this book. And she likes fantasy, but she's not as much of a nerd as I am. And she's been like super into it. She's like listening to it while she's like working. And so, hey, check it out because my book recommendations are always on par and you never have to question. You always know it's going to be good. But sometimes you do have to question, at least in recent years, if it will be good, is Star Wars. So Star Wars has been on a galactic journey over the last couple of years, especially since Disney sort of, bought the property and telling more Star Wars stories. But even before that, with the prequels, those original 3 movies, like when people say, no movie's perfect. Like it just means they haven't seen the original 3 Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
Those movies are perfect. Those movies are fantastic. Those movies are iconic. Prequels, not as much. Sequel trilogy, not as much. The shows, sometimes not as much. So it's sort of been all over the place. But hey, we still love Star Wars. And we talked about last week kind of the current show, which, disclaimer, I have not seen. I don't know if you've seen the most recent episode.
I did. I watched it yesterday.
So I've heard it's episode, what is it, 4?
Yeah, something like that.
Or maybe it's 4 or 5. Everyone's raving about it, but I watched this with my kids, and they have church on Wednesday nights. So I got to wait until tonight to check this thing out. But Ahsoka is the show that, the kind of the latest Star Wars show that's on right now. And it's been getting, it seems, pretty universally, like, people are enjoying this show. It hasn't been as, like, divisive as, not everyone's enjoying it, but, like, not as divisive as some, like, the last season of Mandalorian. Like, Boba Fett was very, I think most people didn't like it. Obi-Wan, some people really liked it. Some people thought it was lame. I kind of thought it was lame. This is a show that seems like, hey, this is a good show. People are enjoying it. But there's sort of an aspect of it. Again, we don't want to necessarily get into a big review, especially because I haven't seen the latest episode. But actually, I wrote an article on this, which will be dropping on our website, thecollision.org. Check it out in the next day or two. Because there's a conversation within this show that I found interesting. Like the way that the show is, because Star Wars is known for a lot of different things, but like probably the Force is like, when you think of Star Wars, you think of, like, the Force, use the Force, Luke. And like, there's all of that is such like central to it has always been central to the show. And in a lot of ways, I think, like, again, Christians have always had different opinions on the Force. Like I know as soon as I've worn like a Star Wars shirt for a review, and like people will comment like, do you know, like, that's like some pagan, unbiblical thing. And like a lot of Christians like us just love Star Wars. So I know it is, people have mixed opinions on it, but like, regardless of what you think of it, like the Force itself is sort of being like maybe the defining, like the overarching like metaphor for faith. Like, like, every preacher in the last like 30 years at some point has used that, like Luke lifting or Yoda lifting the X-Wing out of like faith, like a mustard seed. You too, with the Holy Spirit, can lift your metaphorical X-Wing out of the swine. There's so much in there that does tie in, even if it is itself more like pantheistic and stuff and how
Yeah.
it's portrayed. But I wrote an article, which I thought, even if you're not a Star Wars fan necessarily, I do think there's application kind of beyond just Star Wars for like just the
Yeah.
power of stories to and metaphors to help us understand like our present situation, especially as Christians. Because kind of the thesis, again, I don't want to give away all the punchlines of my article because I think it's rather good. But like the main point in that article is like that like, for 50 years almost, I think like 46 years, we've been telling Star Wars stories. Like the Force has always been central in some way to those stories, but like the way the Force is portrayed or like emphasized has kind of changed over the years. Like it's changed from the way Luke was, Obi-Wan explained it to Luke to how Ahsoka explains it to Sabine in the latest show. And there are many ways if you like trace that progression, like you can actually sort of trace the prevailing mindsets towards spirituality and religion, like in real life, like in society. But you've read this article, the draft, the sneak peek.
Yes.
What
In all of its errors and missed punctuations. No, I'm kidding.
Because we'll get into sort of like how that is, like how it does trace it, but like any sort of first thoughts with some of that?
Yeah, I think it is interesting that it does. I feel like in some ways, maybe broadly speaking, it sort of tracks with, it sort of reflects the culture that we're in. I think, it was very idealistic in the 70s with the original, and it was sort of this, this thing, this higher than yourself, bigger than you sort of thing that you could plug into. And then you just sort of follow the disillusionment with the Force and the Jedi Order, and to now where it's more or less like it's just sort of whatever you make of it, kind of, and it's much more individualistic. Sort of the institutions, like I think, as in reality, like faith in institutions is at an all-time low. I think, like in the Star Wars stories, sort of reflects that like nobody has faith in institutions. All of these more recent stories are about like sort of rogue actors, going out beyond the new order and, kind of figuring things out because, the current order is so like just inept or incompetent, and they have no faith in, either the Jedi Order or, the New Republic or whatever it is. So I think in sort of broad terms, you can kind of see since the start of Star Wars to now, like the idea of the Force, I think, has tracked along with like our faith in institutions. I think in some ways,
because you can almost follow and sort of what I do in the article too, like the progression from like the Force is a more like external reality that like belongs to like this religious institution, like the Jedi. Like the Jedi are the ones that use the Force, and it's the way it's portrayed in the original trilogy is very much like there's this big power out there, and like we kind of reach out and tap into this power, and like we can kind of relate to this power in some way, but it's really sort of the Jedi that do this, which leads like the second sort of phase, like kind of the prequels with like the midichlorians, like where like the Force became very like scientific almost.
Which is sort of an interesting note with that is like I think it's also interesting that like that was when Lucas was like enamored with the technology of making that movie, like, and he just like completely overused all of the new technology that it was at his fingertips. And I think it's just interesting that like the approach to the Force, I think, kind of mirrored some of that as well.
Yeah,
like very scientific, very like
cause like the Force itself was still still sort of this mystical thing, but like you could like measure it. Like it's like, oh, you have more ability to use the Force because like, from this blood sample. So, oh, you're a Force user. The results are in. Like it became very like scientific, which I think like I don't know if intentionally or not, but like those movies also, because of the story they were telling, like very much like focused on like a more cynical depiction of like the institution of the Force as well. Like it was, if the first trilogy is very much like, this religious institution that taps into this power is this noble thing. Like this was like, actually they're power hungry and flawed and short sighted, and like
Yeah.
they're not necessarily a good thing. And I think kind of the continuing that like into like our current era is very much like, well, you know what? We don't really need the Jedi. We don't really need the institutions. Like spirituality is something that's like more individualistic and like, and it's still sort of like out there, but like it's also mostly sort of internal. Because there's a conversation I think in episode 3 of this show where Sabine and Ahsoka are talking in a spaceship, and Sabine says, "I can't use the Force. I don't feel it, not like you do." Ahsoka says, "The Force resides in all living things, even you." Sabine says, "If that's true, then why doesn't everyone use it?" To which Ahsoka says, "Talent is a factor, but training and focus are what truly define someone's success. Not everyone can handle the type of discipline it takes to master the ways of the Force." Which again, if you actually go in the article, I quote some too, like that's actually consistent with what George Lucas said. Like the idea was always that everyone could use the Force. That's just not how it necessarily came out in the originals, but that's the conversation that I sort of got me thinking about this in general. Of like, in so many ways, like even if the way that Lucas perceived the Force hasn't changed, like the emphasis, how it's portrayed has changed to very much like, it's almost more consistent with like deconstruction or like disillusionment with like organized religion, like, and it's very sort of, we all sort of have this within us, and like to tap into the power is more about like us and using our discipline within rather than like kind of surrendering to this thing outside and like being trained by these institutions. Like,
yeah, I think it's interesting that it is sort of reflecting of the times, and it's just sort of like the culture is a bit of a mirror, but it's also a bit of a maybe a window as well, that we can be sort of led by the things that we see on screen, and we can also just see our reflection by the things we see on screen, whether that's in TV or movies. And so I just think it's interesting that something like the Force, how it's portrayed, over this almost 50-year span, like it does track, it seems, quite well with sort of where we are culturally. And I find that really fascinating. Yeah,
because that is the power of like pop culture or stories or metaphors, like that it even something that is outwardly sort of a goofy sci-fi opera fantasy story, like, well, like actually there's not that it's a one-to-one, like it's not as simplistic as sort of that framework, but I think it is a good starting point to like, hey, that does sort of help us understand, like that does reflect prevailing mindsets towards faith and like the church, and sort of how a lot of I think Christians or just people in society are thinking through those issues, and in a more like individualistic, like the church has let us down, so like I'm gonna practice, because like all the heroes now, like in Star Wars, it seems like that use the Force aren't Jedi. Like the Jedi used to be, they're the ones that use the Force.
Yeah.
Or now the Jedi is more like that's more of like a code. Like it's a group that uses it, but like like Ahsoka or Grogu or whoever else of these other heroes, like even sort of Luke at the end of his story, like, so well, you don't really need to be a Jedi to do it though. Like you can practice it more on your own. Like, it's about you and the Force, so what's in you.
Well, which makes me wonder too, like, how many more years do you think before like the Jedi Order is reinstated and like there becomes a need for the Jedi Order again? Because I think it will happen. Like, I think it'll just be a matter of time before like one of these storylines, it's like, oh no, like the Jedi have been like reorganizing, and they've gone through a bit of a reconstruction, or they've had a bit of a revolution within the Order. It's been rebuilt. It's better, and it's actually necessary now because of whatever is happening in Star Wars universe. Like, how long do you think before that happens, or do you think that will happen?
Yeah, because I think even I know there's been rumors or announcements, I think, of like them doing stories beyond like the episodic films of like Rey later, and she starts the Order again, and like does what Luke failed to do, and like I do think eventually, like, so much of Star Wars seems like it's sort of a pendulum of that, and I think so much of society is that way.
Yeah,
it's sort of, hey, the church is bad, we all need to be on our own, and then, well, actually, there's value in like the community and like having these safeguards and like
Yeah.
having these creeds and things. Like maybe religion, like in church, isn't bad. Like maybe it's not okay to be isolated. Like, and I think Star Wars, if they keep telling these stories, will probably reflect some of that. But hey, let us know what you guys think. If regardless if you're a big Star Wars person or not, just on some of that, like is there power in metaphors and stories, and how can, as Christians, we sort of understand the time that we live by looking at just what's popular in the stories being told. For a second time, we don't really have time to get into the VMAs, which I don't think either of us are necessarily super enthusiastic anyways. Short story is that Taylor Swift won everything, because
that's all you need to know. Yeah, just dominated.
So, but yeah, I do encourage you to go check out maybe, I mean, maybe not all of them. Some of them might be a bit vulgar, but I know as a Christian, when these happen, like I am intrigued to like go watch the video or listen to the song, like just to see, okay, this is what's being celebrated. Is there anything like we talked about earlier to dialogue with?
And did NSYNC do a performance, or did they just present an award?
I know
that's the burning question.
Yeah. So we did miss out on an epic NSYNC performance. But hey, let us know what your thoughts on that. But speaking of letting you know our thoughts, particularly my thoughts on recent movies, final thoughts. I was able to see the new Agatha Christie inspired film, A Haunting in Venice. I saw that movie last night, so we'll be recording the review for that as soon as we're done this episode. So that should be out at some point today. If you're curious, movie comes out on Friday. Short version is, I thought it was a good movie. I think there's some stuff in it for Christians, not necessarily content-wise, but like, sort of the outward occult or like supernatural, or it's like it takes place on Halloween. And again, there's more to meets the eye, as you would expect. But there's some of that, but there's also some really interesting themes and stuff. So encourage you, check out my review for that. I did enjoy that movie. Any other thoughts from your end?
Well, I'll be sure to give it either a thumbs up or a thumbs down, whether or not I like it.
Yeah, see if it's a 3 Sam heads out of 10. Also letting you know that we won't be here next week. I know we took last week off for health. We're missing next week, not for health reasons, but for vacation. So we won't be here then, but we'll be back the week after that. So I encourage you guys, don't miss us too much, but join us then. But most of all, guys, thanks for joining us. Have a great week. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.